And now welcome to part 3 of Yeshua's death and the double witness pattern, a calendar crisis. At the start of part 2, I referenced that the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin had significant calendar challenges in the month that Yeshua died. And as we saw in part 1, many in Hebrew roots believe that Yeshua died on a Wednesday and rose on a Saturday night. But one of the big problems is the calendars disagree with that position. And this is something that I really want to spend a little bit of time on here, because it's important to note that it's one thing to make what you feel are plausible assertions about, well, I think the history lines up this way or that. But if the calendar or the astronomy says no, then I believe that's very hard to sustain. And in this case, multiple calendar witnesses say no to this idea. So I will explain that as we move forward. What I mean is, whether looking at the Eternal Torah calendar or the Rabbinic calendar, Wednesday afternoon is the 13th of Abib. In order for this theory to be right, it would have to be the 15th. Some groups dealt with this problem by alleging two different calendars were in operation, one that Messiah kept and one that the Pharisees kept. There's only one problem with that. It's impossible. It breaks the scripture itself. The reason is simple. Dozens of disputes between Yeshua and the Pharisees are recorded in the Gospels. So if Yeshua disagreed with them on when a feast like Passover was, wouldn't he have said something? Furthermore, wouldn't the Pharisees have said, ignore this Nazarene, he doesn't even know when Pesach is, if that were true? Whatever calendar then Yeshua and the Pharisees shared, and it is clear they never disagreed on any Shabbat or feast timing, that had to be the right calendar. And that's why in Matthew 23, verses 1 through 2, Yeshua said that the Pharisees sit not on the seat of Moses, which is how some translations read. You go back to Yeshua's Aramaic, and the word kursia is throne of Moshe. And what that means, that's an expression that says that when they are not doing oral law, when they are doing just what the Torah says, they're the judges put in the place of Moshe, or in place of the elders that Moshe inaugurated. In other words, the lack of disagreement shows it is the same calendar for everyone. And if the Pharisees rule it by sitting on the throne of Moshe, then that calendar must also be the calendar of Moshe. It must go back to Moshe. And additionally, there are cases where this calendar agreement between them is directly stated or directly proven to be necessary. For example, this is from John 7, verse 37 through 38. Now on the great day, which is the last of the feast, Yeshua was standing, and he cried out and said, if a man thirst, let him come to me and drink. Anyone who believes in me, as the scriptures have said, rivers of living water, I should say, will flow from his belly. Right? Here's why this matters. For the past week of the Feast of Tabernacles, or it's called Sukkot in Hebrew, the Pharisees have been enjoying a lovely water ritual, which is the highlight of the season. However, on this last day, the last and greatest day of the feast, no water ritual is done on that 8th day. Yeshua then is using that 8th day to make a point that his living waters are greater than any water ritual they had seen over the past week. And what this means is Yeshua's comment about living waters coming, out of his belly makes no sense on any other day of the Hebrew year. Therefore, everyone at that scene, whether they were Pharisees, Messiah, or Messiah's disciples, they had to agree that this was the last day of Sukkot, or Tabernacles. They were literally on the same calendar page. But if that's the case, where is the calendar crisis? And the answer is a very rare series of events in 30 CE, the year Yeshua died. In terms of the eternal Torah calendar, there are two rules that are relevant here. First, that the new moon starts the new Hebrew month, the sunset after lunar conjunction. And that is regardless as to whether the waxing crescent is or is not seen on that particular evening. The second rule is that the new moon nearest the start of vernal equinox must always be Abib, the first Hebrew month. What is also very interesting in this case is that no matter how you count the new moon and Pesach 2 weeks later from that new moon, the main calendar systems, which is to say eternal Torah calendar, rabbinic calendar, and even though rabbinic and others didn't even exist in the first century, these calendars agree with the timing. Okay? And that agreement is with regards to both the Hebrew day, Abib 15, and the day of the week that Yeshua died. And that day that Yeshua died was not a Wednesday. But to understand what the day was and why, we need to look at the conditions on the ground, which is a saying that I am somewhat fond of and refer to relatively regularly. In the spring of 30 CE, two rare events came together to create the most challenging judgment call that the Sanhedrin would ever be forced to make. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I'm going to tell you right now that I am definitely not. You see, what I'm about to describe is something that is virtually unprecedented in the entire scope of biblical history, that happened specifically only on that March new moon of 30 CE, which then affected the Passover timing 2 weeks later. And we'll see why this is unprecedented as we go through the data. Let's get back to this. As I said, this was the most challenging judgment call the Sanhedrin would ever be forced to make, because all they had to regulate their calendar was their own eyes and some math. That's it. What they did not have were precision tools of modern astronomy, such as telescopes or astronomical software. So here was the first challenge. My team compiled data from 4,481 years, from 1481 BCE to 3000 CE. 1481 BCE is before the Exodus. Okay? So here's why that's an important distinction to make. You see, it is at just before Exodus, in the book of Exodus, chapter 12, verses 1 through 2, that Father Yah speaks to Moshe and says that this month of Abib will now, from now on, be the first of your months. Prior to that, Abib was not the first month of the year, and the Hebrews were not using the moon to count to the feasts. They were on a solar calendar. I know that's a bit hard for folks to wrap their head around, and it's a very, very long story, but the quick headline I can give as an example is this. When you read the account of the months of Noah's flood, and you have to try to match these 5 months, you have this range of dates from the 17th day of month 2 to the 17th day of month 7. Right? So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. You have to have at least 151 days in that period of time. In order for that math to work, you must have 5 30-day months in a row. The problem, for those who think this is a lunar calendar, is that that has never happened on the planet Earth. Okay? I've had astronomers check this. We never have had 5 30-day months in a row. Let's say, for the sake of argument, there just happened to be one group of months that fit that. One, that would have to be proven astronomically. And two, because it's so rare, I would expect the scripture to comment on it. But if we're going by natural timing, which very much seems to be the case when we're reading Genesis, Noah can, at the time of the flood, is not on a lunar system telling him when the months are. He's on a Hodesh, which can refer to a solar cycle and later refers to a lunar cycle. A final bit of evidence on this before we move on is simply that when you read about Moshe being born, right, that's the first time that months are called lunar months in the Torah. When it says they hid the baby Moshe for 3 months, that word is Yariach. Yariach means moon. Prior to that, the months were called Hodesh, which is more vague. Might be the solar months, might be the lunar months. But this is the first time that we know specifically that, it's going to be in the generation of Moshe when the moon is going to count to the feast. Prior to that, the feasts are not given. So this is an important point. Let's get back to our slides. So they compiled data from 4,481 years, from 1481 BCE to 3000 CE, because that will include the entire history of this calendar of Moses that we're discussing. And during that time, 30 CE was one of only 59 years where the vernal equinox and the new moon came within 5 hours of each other. That comes out to being only 1.3% of all cases across that vast amount of time. 1.3%. In addition, we also had to factor in whether that March new moon happened before or after sunset, because the Hebrew day ends at sunset. So when that new moon happens, it will either, the sun will have already set and now it's that Hebrew day, or it will be the next Hebrew day. And we also have to compare whether the new moon or the vernal equinox, which one came first. Those are all very important calendar considerations that need to be factored in. So when we plug in all the relevant factors to find a year that precisely matches 30 CE, the number of occurrences drops from 59, which was 1.3%, it drops down to 5. I'm going to show a chart on the next page, which was compiled for me. And I had to use images from different parts of this chart, so it sort of looks like someone pasting newspaper articles that they find interesting. But I assure you the data is real. It has been compiled by computer. It has been verified by computer. And the only thing lacking are my artistic skills to show it to you. That's the best I can do. What this chart shows is that in 30 AD CE, the new moon was after sunset, okay? So that was at 10:05 p.m., but it was before the vernal equinox, okay? It was before the vernal equinox. And both were within 5 hours of between each other, okay? Here's the last time that those factors lined up exactly that way. How far back do we have to go before we get a March new moon and vernal equinox alignment that is exactly like this? Get a load of this. Look. 1106 BCE. 30 CE's exact conditions only happened one time before in that data set, and would not happen again after 30 CE until 975. After the 975 alignment, there's only two to get to the year 3000, in 1157 and 1309 CE. By any definition, any standard you want to use, That's a very rare event. But there was another rare event that was happening over top this one, as if what I just said was not problematic enough. Get a load of this. Using the same techniques for the modern astronomical software, Alcyon tables, and guide software, my science team and I were able to reproduce the night sky from 30 CE. While we could not tell if a given night 2,000 years ago was cloudy, we could use data about the moon to tell if it could be seen over Jerusalem skies or not. And what we found was that in addition to that same closeness between new moon and vernal equinox, and I will get into why that matters a little later, the new moon itself was not seen over Jerusalem skies for 3 straight evenings. Declaring the new moon is an intricate process. It's a choreography. It begins with it going into darkness or conjunction, then sunset after conjunction, and then the crescent comes as a backwards marker to confirm it. But if the Abib new moon, that first moon of spring, that sets the entire Hebrew year up, and if it's not seen and comes very close to the vernal equinox, the vernal equinox can unfold over 1 to 2 days by ancient methods. This makes things way more difficult even than it was before. So on the morning of the 27th day of the 12th Hebrew month of Adar, which is March 18th in our Gregorian calendar, the old crescent was last seen. But the next morning, 28 Adar, March 19th, it was not seen at all. It had gone into conjunction. By the evening of 29 Adar, which is the 20th of March, the new moon still not seen, and even when calculation determined the next night, March 21st, was the new moon for the first Hebrew month of Abib, you still don't see the crescent. This is very rare on top of all the other rarities that we've been seeing for this year. This is now a crisis. The signs don't agree, but a judgment call must be made for Pesach to be on time. The event is not just rare, it is literally unprecedented. The arrival of the vernal equinox is tracked by a series of signs over 1 to 2 days, because people say, well, how did the ancients do it? And what's also important is how they didn't do it. They could not determine the moment of spring to the minute and second like we do today. They did not have that skill. The new moon, though, counts the days of the feast in relation to its timing with the vernal equinox. So the new moon that is nearest vernal equinox would be the first Hebrew month. 99.99% of the time, and I'm being literal here, while one sign is concealed, another 1 or 2 signs will make the call. But in this extremely rare case, all witnesses are offline. What can the Sanhedrin possibly do in a situation like this? There is literally, as I said, no precedent for this scenario, which leads me to believe Father Yah intended the year his son Yeshua died to be utterly unique in astronomical terms, just like his birth was. And it was. In 4,481 years, only 4 other March new moons had the new moon and vernal equinox exactly like 30 CE, the year Yeshua died. But get a load of this. None of the others had this problem of not seeing the new moon for such a long period of time. That is utterly unique to the year that Yeshua died, going as far back as 1481 BC and as far forwards as the year 3000 AD. Not only was this a nightmare scenario for the Sanhedrin, but 30 CE also created headaches for me, as I'm trying to figure out how the calendar I knew would have dealt with this completely unique situation. And to make matters worse, the key data about not seeing the new moon for 3+ days was in an old book I was researching and writing, and I never finished it. I had put this data away for 7+ years. I never looked at it again. So I forgot this essential piece to the puzzle. Without knowing that the new moon could not be seen for 3+ days, the timing of new moon and vernal equinox was even more mysterious than it needed to be and was already. So I had to decide that, make some attempt at trying to figure this out. And what I decided was, since the vernal equinox was what we call the higher sign, it's dealing with the sun and the stars, not dealing with the earth, or the moon, it would have pulled the timing of the new moon back to the vernal equinox. In other words, the rule that worked 99.99% of the time pointed to Yeshua dying on one day, while the intervention of the vernal equinox, if it overrode that timing, would force the new moon to be called on another day, Thursday. Now I want you to imagine this. The issue is, there is, like I said, no precedent for either the ancient authorities or for me to figure out what to do in this situation. There's nothing I can consult. There's nothing they could consult. So what do? You try to look at the data. You try to make the best choice that you can, that you feel the majority fits. And in that case, I believed in this one little time, the rule that worked every other time throughout all of history would be set aside, and the vernal equinox would mark the start of the first Hebrew month, the lunar month. But I was wrong. Pure and simple. And I'll explain why. It turned out, though, the regular rule was fine. It worked even in this extremely odd, unprecedented situation. But I didn't see that until I found my old data again. And also, while the foundation of my calendar and chronology work began in the 1990s, the cutting-edge software and data that I needed from that software to confirm it did not come about until 2009. During those 2 decades, the best information that I or anyone had was that Yeshua could only die on the 15th of Abib in the year 33 CE. That was the only year that we could determine that would have been on the 15th of Abib that was a possible death year. Since there was overwhelming evidence from several key places, which is what we went over in the previous videos, saying that Yeshua could only die in the year 30, 3 years earlier, this became a huge problem. The biblical and historical evidence shouted for 30 AD, but the astronomy seemed to indicate 33 CE or AD. That is, again, until the new data and the software came in 2009. The problem was I did not recognize the full ramifications of that data, and when plans to do this book fell through, I just put it on the electronic back shelf, and I forgot about some of those details. The very details that I would realize pointed to a different conclusion. So when I found that data again, I took a fresh look at it. I realized there was evidence proving that Yeshua's death was on the 15th of Abib and in the year 30 CE after all. But my previous idea that was a Thursday was incorrect. So it's not a Wednesday, and it's not a Thursday either. But again, we must get back to the fact that the Sanhedrin did not have any of these great tools that we have today. How will they deal with this unique series of back-to-back challenges? The answer is, over the centuries, the Sanhedrin and its predecessors compiled a great deal of data, especially about the behavior of the moon. We know this from the Talmud, by the way. So when all other techniques of observation had failed, they returned to this data to look at the math. That's what I would have done. And after examining the facts, they deliberated and made a highly educated and informed estimate, and they called the night of March 21st, 1 Abib. When we use the eternal Torah calendar or rabbinic data, They also say in 30 AD, 1 Abib was on our March 21st. They agree with what the Sanhedrin came up with. They agree, the rabbis, with what the Eternal Torah calendar came up with if we just use that rule as it is. So let's recap at this point. In this point in our studies, this is where we are. Yeshua's ministry began in the fall of 26 and ended in the spring of 30 when he died on the 15th of Abib, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The 15th of Abib was proven to not have been either a Wednesday or a Thursday, but the resurrection is still on Sunday morning. These facts then led to an even bigger dilemma, as if I wasn't dealing with enough issues. If we somehow are to use a 3-day, 3-night time frame from crucifixion, how can this work when the calendar is putting Yeshua up on the stake the one day I never expected? In other words, is it really possible that Yeshua died on a Friday afternoon after all? This has been the biggest stumbling block of them all. A Friday crucifixion? Really? I, along with just about everyone else in this faith walk of Hebrew roots, I have ridiculed this idea for decades. How can you fit 3 days and 3 nights from Friday afternoon to Sunday dawn? Or some would say, no, it's actually Saturday night. It's impossible, right? Well, in our next part, that is exactly what I will try to prove, the impossible. The problem has been, while this is the view of traditional Christianity, the church has not done a serious effort in looking into why so many of us had basic problems with their viewpoint. And that's because both the church and us in Hebrew roots, we missed something important. We missed something that was hiding in plain sight. The answer to all of this issue, the controversy, the disputes, has been staring us in the face all along. But to this hour, we haven't seen it, we haven't taught it, we haven't celebrated it. In fact, I didn't see it myself until the start of this year, January of 2019. And I've been looking into this for a quarter century. What is this missing piece? I can sum it up in one word. It's prophecy. So we will explore that, what the prophets speak, coming up next.